I never thought the deepest betrayal of my life would come from my own child. One moment, I was standing inside the house I had spent decades building, believing I still belonged there. The next, my clothes were being thrown into the rain while I was told I had no rights, no voice, and no place anymore. I stood soaked, humiliated, watched by neighbors who said nothing, realizing that love, when taken for granted, can turn cruel. That night shattered everything I thought I knew about family, sacrifice, and silence. And it was only the beginning of a truth far more devastating than the storm itself. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 64 years old. I live in a pale blue house near the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the air smells of salt and jasmine, and people believe they can tell everything about you by the way your porch looks. From the outside, my life appears calm, even privileged. I live in a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, and my daughter is considered a local success story. Most people assume I am simply a retired widow enjoying the comfort her child provides. I let them believe that, because correcting them would require a conversation no one ever asks to have. Charleston is the kind of city that remembers appearances. Neighbors wave politely, ask surface-level questions, and quietly measure your worth based on property lines and social standing. Our street is lined with trimmed hedges and carefully painted doors. People smile easily here, but they also watch closely. They know my daughter, Rachel Collins, far better than they know me. She is 38, confident, well-dressed, and widely admired as a successful real estate agent. Her face appears on local advertisements. Her name circulates at charity events, and her story is always told the same way: a woman who built everything herself. I live in the same house, yet I exist on the margins of that story. When neighbors speak to me, their tone is gentle, almost charitable. They ask if I am comfortable, if my daughter is taking good care of me. No one asks what I used to do, or what I contributed, or how long I have been managing my own life. I am introduced, when I am introduced at all, as Rachel's mother, nothing more. It is a small title that carries very little weight. I share this house with Rachel and her husband, Evan Miller. Evan moves through the space with the confidence of a man who believes everything around him belongs to him by default. I move quietly. I learned to do that years ago, long before I ever came to live here. I avoid interrupting conversations. I keep my routines predictable. I stay out of the way. It is not because I am weak or confused. It is because I believed for a long time that silence was the price of peace. What no one sees is the history beneath these walls. Before I was a mother living quietly by the sea, I spent more than 30 years as a senior accounting manager in the construction industry. I balanced budgets larger than most people's mortgages. I understood contracts, projections, and risk long before my daughter ever signed her first listing agreement. When my husband was alive, I handled every financial decision in our household. After he passed, I continued to do so, not just for myself, but eventually for Rachel as well. The early years of her career did not fund themselves. The planning did not happen by accident. I guided her, financed her first steps, and structured the stability that allowed her to take risks. This house, the one people admire so openly, was purchased with my money and my foresight. Still, I never corrected the narrative. I told myself that mothers do not need credit, that love is not transactional, and that being needed was enough. Over time, though, something shifted. The quiet I maintained began to take on a different meaning. My restraint started to look like absence. My presence became optional. I realized, slowly and without drama, that when you stay silent long enough, other people begin to tell your story for you. And once they do, taking it back becomes much harder than anyone expects. If you're still watching and starting to sense something isn't right in this family, please comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what looks like small changes at first will soon turn into something far more dangerous. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Living in that house began to feel different in ways I could not immediately explain. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no moment I could point to and say this was when everything changed. Instead, it was a quiet shift, the kind that only becomes visible after it has already settled into place. The rooms were the same, the view from the windows unchanged, yet I felt less certain of where I belonged within those walls. Rachel started making decisions without mentioning them to me. At first, they were small things. Dinner times moved later because it suited her schedule. Guests appeared with little notice, and I learned to retreat to my room so as not to interrupt. Furniture was rearranged, then replaced, and no one asked if I act what I thought. I adjusted my routines without complaint, telling myself this was normal, that adult children eventually take the lead. Still, the adjustments always seemed to come from me, never from them. The language in the house changed as well. Rachel began referring to the place as her house when speaking to others. Evan followed her lead, discussing repairs and improvements as if I were a temporary consideration rather than a permanent presence. These were not cruel statements on their own. They were casual, almost careless, which made them harder to challenge. Noticed them, stored them away, and said nothing. Silence had always been my instinct. Neighbors treated me differently, too. Their smiles carried a softness that felt misplaced. They asked if I was settling in comfortably, if Rachel was taking good care of me, if I needed anything. The assumption was clear. I was no longer a woman with agency, but someone being accommodated. I realized that Rachel had been shaping this image long before I noticed its effects. People believed it because it was easier than asking questions. Financial matters slipped from my hands almost unnoticed. Mail that once came directly to me began appearing already opened. Bank statements were rerouted. When I asked about a document I had not seen, Evan told me he was keeping things organized. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he was being helpful. I reminded myself that I trusted my daughter, that families share responsibilities, that I was overthinking. Even so, a familiar unease settled in my chest, the kind I used to feel when numbers did not align. I questioned myself constantly during that period. I wondered if I was becoming overly sensitive, if age had made me suspicious where I had once been practical. I told myself that stepping back was a form of generosity, that allowing Rachel to feel in control was part of being a supportive mother. I clung to the belief that love would naturally correct any imbalance, yet my professional instincts, honed over decades, refused to quiet themselves. Without announcing it to anyone, I began keeping copies of important papers. I noted dates, changes, and patterns in a small notebook I kept tucked away. It was not an act of defiance. It was preparation, the same kind I had practiced my entire career. I did not intend to use it. I only wanted to know that I could. The hardest realization was understanding that respect rarely disappears all at once. It is taken gradually, in ways that seem reasonable when viewed individually. By the time you recognize the pattern, you are already standing on unfamiliar ground. I sensed that something larger was forming just beyond my awareness, and I knew, with a certainty I could not yet explain, that the next step would not be small at all. If you're still here and noticing how silence can slowly erase a person, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following closely, because the next chapter reveals the first moment I realized this wasn't just misunderstanding anymore. Let's move on to chapter 3. The morning Rachel asked me to sit down with her felt different before a single word was spoken. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settles when something has already been decided. Sunlight filtered through the windows, touching the table where a neat stack of papers waited. I had seen that arrangement before in my life, many times, and it never meant anything casual. My body recognized the tension, even as my mind searched for reassurance. Rachel spoke carefully, with a softness that felt practiced. She explained that the documents were only meant to help, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. She framed it as planning ahead, the responsible thing families do when they care about each other. Evan stood nearby, leaning against the counter, watching me rather than the papers. He said very little, but his attention felt heavy, expectant, as if the outcome mattered more than the explanation. I picked up the documents and began to read. Years of training took over automatically. I did not skim. I followed every clause, every condition, every implication. The language was polished, almost kind, but intent has a way of revealing itself when you look closely enough. What I saw was not protection, it was transfer. Authority over my finances, my property, my decisions, all contingent on a single evaluation of my mental capacity. One signature could erase decades of independence. I set the papers down and told them I was not ready to sign. I did not accuse or raise my voice. I said I needed time. The air in the room shifted immediately. Rachel's expression tightened in a way I had not seen before, a flicker of impatience she quickly tried to hide. Evan stepped forward, explaining again why it made sense, why it would be easier for everyone. His words were calm, but they carried weight, as if my agreement were expected rather than requested. I repeated that I needed time. That was all. No explanation beyond that. Silence followed, thicker than before. In that moment, I understood that my hesitation had disrupted something larger than a simple conversation. This was not a suggestion that had come together overnight. It was part of a plan, and plans do not respond well to resistance. Later that afternoon, I passed the hallway outside Rachel's office and heard her voice through the partially closed door. She was on the phone, speaking in the low, careful tone people use when they believe they are alone. I did not intend to listen, but certain words caught my attention and rooted me in place. She mentioned a doctor she trusted, an assessment, documentation prepared ahead of time, not accusations, not emergencies, preparations. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the weight of that realization settle. What hurt most was not the paperwork itself, but the understanding that it was not spontaneous. Someone had thought this through. Someone had imagined a version of me that suited their needs better than the truth. The trust I had extended without question suddenly felt fragile, like glass already cracked. That evening, I made copies of every document they had shown me. I wrote down the date, the time, and the exact circumstances under which they had been presented. I did not confront anyone. I did not announce my concerns. I knew enough to understand that clarity would come later, if I allowed things to unfold naturally. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. As I placed the papers away, I accepted something I had been resisting since the first small changes began. This was no longer a misunderstanding or a matter of adjustment. A line had been crossed quietly, deliberately. Whatever came next would require more than patience. It would require awareness, restraint, and the willingness to see my own daughter as she truly was, not as I wished her to be. If you're still watching and felt that quiet shift of power starting to happen. Comment number 3, so I know you're still with me. Because from this point on, things don't stay private, and the stakes rise fast. Let's continue with chapter 4. After the conversation about the papers, the house settled into a new kind of quiet. No one mentioned what had happened, yet everything felt altered. The silence was no longer neutral. It carried an edge, a message that did not need words. I moved through the days carefully, aware that any misstep might be noticed, remembered, and reshaped into something else. I made an effort to keep the peace. I stayed out of shared spaces unless I was needed. I adjusted my schedule to match Rachel's, ate later, spoke less. I told myself that this was temporary, that families sometimes go through awkward seasons, especially when roles begin to shift. I believed that patience would smooth the tension, that restraint would be interpreted as understanding. That belief cost me more than I expected. I began to notice how conversations changed when I entered a room. Rachel's voice would soften, almost theatrically, as if she were performing concern. She asked if I had taken my vitamins, if I was tired, if I remembered an appointment I had never missed. These questions were not for me. They were for anyone listening. Evan played his part well, nodding along, reinforcing the idea that they were simply being careful, responsible, attentive. The story about me traveled faster than I realized. I heard it in fragments at first, passed through walls and opened doors. A comment about my memory, a suggestion that I had been confused lately, always delivered with a tone of worry, never accusation. That was the cleverest part. Concern is difficult to challenge without appearing defensive. Each remark added a layer to a narrative I had not agreed to, but could not easily interrupt. Neighbors began to look at me differently. Their greetings lingered longer, their questions became gentler. One woman asked if I enjoyed living with my daughter, if it was comforting to have someone taking care of me. Another suggested that places existed where people my age could have support and structure. No one asked whether I wanted that. They spoke as if the decision had already been made somewhere beyond my reach. Evan grew more comfortable discussing me as a responsibility rather than a person. He talked about schedules, accommodations, and future planning as though I were an item to be managed. He never raised his voice. He never used harsh words. That was what made it effective. Everything sounded reasonable on the surface, and reasonableness can be a powerful disguise. I began to examine myself more closely than I ever had before. I tested my memory, replayed conversations, reviewed details from years past. Everything was intact. My mind was clear. Still, doubt crept in. It is unsettling how easily repeated suggestions can erode confidence, even when you know they are false. I understood then how manipulation works best when it invites you to question yourself. Quietly, I continued documenting what I could. I wrote down comments, noted dates, observed patterns. I did not correct anyone. I did not defend myself. I had learned that resistance would only confirm the image they were creating. Instead, I watched as control shifted not through force, but through belief. The more people trusted their version of me, the less my own truth seemed to matter. What frightened me most was realizing that authority is not only about money or ownership, it is about credibility. Whoever controls the story controls the outcome. As that understanding settled in, I knew something irreversible was approaching. The groundwork had been laid, the roles assigned. All that remained was a moment public enough to make their version permanent. If you're still here and starting to feel the tension tighten, comment number 4 below. Because the next chapter is where everything explodes in public, and nothing can be taken back after that. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. The night of the celebration arrived with a kind of forced brightness that made everything feel unreal. The house filled with voices and laughter, the kind that carries easily through open doors and wide rooms. Music played softly in the background, glasses clinked, and the familiar space transformed into a stage. I stood at the edge of it all, aware that my role had already been decided before the first guest arrived. Rachel moved through the room with confidence, greeting people with practiced warmth. She looked exactly like the woman they expected her to be: successful, composed, admired. Evan stayed close to her, attentive and proud. I was asked, quietly and without ceremony, to remain in the kitchen unless needed. It was presented as a practical choice, nothing personal, but the effect was unmistakable. I became part of the background, present only to keep things running smoothly. From where I stood, I could hear fragments of conversation drifting in and out. Compliments followed Rachel wherever she went. People praised her determination, her independence, her ability to build something from nothing. Each word landed gently, but the accumulation felt heavy. I watched her accept those praises without hesitation, without qualification, as if no other hands had ever been involved. I told myself to breathe, to remain still, to let the evening pass. At one point, a guest glanced toward me and made an offhand remark about how fortunate I must be to live in such a beautiful home. Rachel answered before I could. Her voice was light, reassuring, almost affectionate. She explained that I was comfortable there, that I had been lucky to have a place to stay while she managed everything else. The sentence was short, almost polite, but it carried a finality that stunned me. In that moment, I understood that the story had been fully rewritten, and I was no longer part of its foundation. I did not react right away. I watched the faces around me, the subtle nods of agreement, the way the room absorbed her version of events without question. There was a strange clarity in realizing that this was how I was seen now, not as a contributor, not as a presence, but as an attachment. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it, something steadier took hold. I began to see the situation as it truly was. Later, as the evening continued, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. Rachel spoke with someone about a loan, about leverage and timing. She mentioned the house casually, as though ownership were unquestionable. I recognized the language immediately, the tone of someone using an asset as security. The realization landed quietly, but with force. Decisions were being made that depended on assumptions I had never agreed to. When I finally spoke, it was not out of anger. It was not loud or dramatic. I stated a simple truth, one I had held for years without needing to say aloud. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused. The air shifted. Evan stepped in quickly, redirecting attention, ushering me away from the center of the room as though containing a problem before it could spread. Rachel's expression hardened, embarrassment flashing across her face before she masked it with irritation. I found myself standing apart, the noise of the party continuing as if nothing had happened. That contrast felt unbearable. I realized then that silence had protected them far more than it had ever protected me. By breaking it, even briefly, I had disrupted the balance they relied on. The cost of that disruption was already becoming clear. As the evening wore on, the distance between us solidified into something cold and deliberate. I understood that what I had done could not be undone, and that the response would not be gentle. The celebration continued, but for me, the night had already ended. Something essential had fractured, and I sensed that the next step would not be contained within polite smiles or quiet exclusions. It would be decisive, and it would come soon. The house felt hollow once the last guest left. Laughter faded, doors closed, and the rooms returned to their familiar shapes, but something essential had been stripped away. The quiet that followed was sharp and restless, charged with resentment that no one tried to disguise. I could feel it pressing in as I stood alone, aware that the balance I had preserved for so long was gone. Evan was the first to speak. His voice carried none of the practiced politeness he used with others. It was direct, impatient, and full of accusation. Rachel followed, her anger cutting deeper because it came wrapped in familiarity. They framed the evening as my fault, my presence as a disruption, my truth as an embarrassment they had been forced to manage. There was no attempt to understand, only a demand that I accept their version of events and retreat quietly. The conversation did not last long. It did not need to. Decisions had already been made. Evan moved through the house with purpose, opening doors, pulling drawers, collecting pieces of my life as if they were clutter that needed to be cleared away. Rachel stood nearby, arms folded, her expression fixed and distant. She did not stop him. She did not look at me. Her silence carried more weight than his actions. I watched as my belongings were gathered without care. Clothes, papers, small objects I had kept close for years were carried outside and dropped onto the grass. The sound of fabric hitting the ground was dull and final. By the time the first drops of rain fell, the message was unmistakable. This was not a request. It was an eviction. The rain came quickly, heavy, and unrelenting. It soaked through everything, blurring edges, turning the yard into a dark, uneven surface. Neighbors appeared at their windows, drawn by the noise and movement. I saw faces, curious and uncertain, but no one intervened. Evan lifted his phone, capturing the scene with an ease that told me he believed he was documenting a victory. Rachel remained in the doorway, framed by light, untouched by the weather or the consequences. I stood there, surrounded by what had been thrown away, feeling the cold seep into my skin. There were many things I could have done in that moment. I could have pleaded, argued, reminded them of the years that led us here. I could have collapsed under the weight of it all. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I stayed calm. The choice felt instinctive, almost automatic, as if my mind had finally accepted what my heart had resisted. I gathered what I could without rushing. Each movement was deliberate, controlled. The rain blurred my vision, but it also clarified something important. Whatever they believed they were taking from me had already been lost long before that night. What remained was my agency, and that was not something they could discard. When I finally turned away from the house, I did not look back. The path ahead was dark and wet, unfamiliar and uncertain, but it was mine to walk. With each step, the decision solidified. I would not return to that doorway seeking permission or understanding. I would not explain myself again to people who had already chosen not to listen. As I moved away, I felt a strange mixture of grief and resolve settle into place. The relationship I thought I had protected no longer existed, but in its absence, something else emerged. Clarity. The knowledge that the next steps would be difficult, public, and irreversible. I welcomed that certainty. For the first time in a long while, I was not waiting to see what they would do next. I had already chosen. If you're still watching after what just happened, comment number 6, so I know you're still here. Because walking into the rain was only the beginning, and what comes next will change everything legally and permanently. Let's move on to Chapter 7. The storm had passed by the time I reached the small roadside motel, but it still echoed in my body. My clothes were damp, my hands unsteady, yet my mind felt sharper than it had in months. Exhaustion settled into my bones, but panic did not follow. Something had shifted during that walk away from the house. The shock was over. What remained was resolve. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and replayed the night with a clarity that surprised me. Every movement, every expression, every moment when a choice had been made without me. I understood then that the rain had done more than soak my belongings. It had exposed them, not just to neighbors or passing cars, but to consequence. Actions that might have remained hidden inside a family had unfolded in public view. I contacted my attorney early the next morning. I had prepared for that call long before the storm, even if I had hoped never to make it. The documentation was already organized: copies of agreements, notes with dates and times, records of conversations and changes. I sent everything I had, including a written account of the eviction as it happened. There was no emotion in that message, only facts. Facts were enough. By midday, the story had begun to move on its own. One neighbor forwarded me a video I had not known existed. Another sent a message offering to testify if needed. The footage Evan recorded, the one he believed would humiliate me, circulated quietly through the neighborhood. Context followed it naturally. People who had once nodded politely now asked questions. Curiosity turned into concern, then into judgment. The narrative they had relied on started to fracture. My attorney confirmed what I already suspected. The conditional residency agreement had been violated clearly and publicly. The attempt to remove me without notice, especially under those conditions, carried serious implications. What had been framed as a domestic disagreement now met legal definitions that could not be ignored. The house was no longer a private stage. It was evidence. As the day unfolded, I felt a strange calm settle in. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt steady. For the first time in a long while, I stopped wondering whether I had done something wrong. The responsibility for what had happened belonged exactly where it should. I had not created the situation. I had simply stopped absorbing it. That night, alone in the unfamiliar room, I considered the years I had spent shrinking myself for the sake of peace. I thought about how easily patience can be mistaken for permission. The loneliness was still there, undeniable and sharp, but it no longer carried confusion. It was a consequence I could accept. Powerlessness was not. The next steps were explained to me plainly. There would be formal action. There would be no quiet resolution. Once the process began, it would move forward regardless of how anyone felt about it. I agreed without hesitation. I understood that stopping now would mean accepting the version of events that had already harmed me. I would not do that again. As I turned off the light, I realized the night had given me something unexpected. Witnesses, proof, momentum. The storm had forced what was hidden into the open, and the wheels it set in motion could not be turned back. Whatever happened next would not depend on my silence. It would depend on the truth, and the truth had finally found its footing. Morning arrived quietly at the motel, stripped of drama, as if the night before had never happened. I woke before the alarm, fully dressed in resolve rather than fear. The rain had washed the air clean, and with it, the last of my hesitation. When my phone rang, I knew what it would be before I answered. The process I had set in motion was ready to move without me asking again. My attorney spoke plainly. The conditional residency agreement had been reviewed and deemed violated beyond dispute. The documentation, paired with witness accounts and video evidence, left no room for interpretation. Emergency measures had been approved. Authorities would go to the house that morning. There was nothing more to decide. I agreed to be present, not because it was required, but because absence had cost me enough. We arrived together, my attorney and I, as patrol cars idled along the curb. The street looked unchanged, but the mood had shifted. Curtains moved. Neighbors gathered at careful distance, their curiosity tempered by the presence of uniforms and official vehicles. This time, the scene was orderly, procedural, almost clinical. The chaos of the storm had given way to structure. Standing there, I noticed how different it felt to return with clarity. I was not there to explain or defend myself. The facts would do that work. The officers approached the door with calm authority, and when it opened, the expressions inside told their own story. Shock arrived first, followed by disbelief. The confidence I had watched for years drained quickly when faced with something that could not be negotiated. Inside, the house felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because the power within it had. Documents were presented and read aloud with precision. Ownership, conditions, violations. Each point landed cleanly, without commentary or accusation. What had once been framed as family dynamics was now reduced to legal terms that carried weight and consequence. Rachel attempted to speak, her voice unsteady, reaching for explanations that no longer held. Evan stood back, silent now, his earlier certainty nowhere to be found. Their responses came too late and without foundation. The order was clear: temporary removal, no debate, no exceptions. The process moved forward exactly as outlined. I remained still, observing rather than participating. There was no satisfaction in watching their control dissolve, only a quiet recognition that truth does not require performance. It simply waits. As officers explained the next steps, neighbors listened with a focus they had not given me before. The story they had accepted so easily was being replaced in real time, not by my words, but by evidence. When Rachel and Evan gathered what they could, the house seemed to exhale. The space they vacated did not feel victorious, only settled. I stood in the living room after they left, surrounded by the same walls that had once made me feel small. Nothing had been restored yet, but something essential had been corrected. Outside, neighbors approached with hesitant expressions, apologies forming without fully becoming words. I accepted their presence without resentment. Understanding often arrives late, but it arrives nonetheless. What mattered was that it arrived now, when it could still mean something. As the patrol cars pulled away, I remained where I was, neither celebrating nor grieving. The law had done what it was meant to do. It had listened, weighed, and acted. The door had been opened, not just to the house, but to the next phase of what would follow. Justice rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it simply shows up, does its work, and leaves behind a silence that feels earned. If you're still with me and want to see how this all truly ends, comment number 8 below. Because the final outcome isn't just about justice, it's about what remains after everything is taken away. Now, let's move on to the conclusion. The house settled into a quiet that felt unfamiliar at first. After days of tension and movement, the stillness carried weight. I walked through the rooms slowly, not to reclaim them, but to understand what remained. Nothing had been repaired yet, and nothing felt celebratory. What I felt instead was the end of a long misunderstanding about my place in the world. My attorney kept me informed as the legal process continued. Ownership was reaffirmed without ambiguity. The conditional residency agreement was formally voided, and the boundaries were set with language that left no room for reinterpretation. Everything unfolded as it should have years ago, methodical and unremarkable. That normalcy was its own kind of relief. There was no argument left to have. News travels quickly in a town like this. Within days, Rachel's professional circle began to pull away. Clients canceled meetings, calls went unanswered. The confidence that had once drawn people toward her now repelled them, replaced by uncertainty and caution. Reputation, I learned again, is fragile when it has been built on omission. It does not collapse loudly. It thins, then disappears. The marriage followed a similar pattern. Without the structure that had supported it, cracks widened into separations that could no longer be disguised. Evan withdrew when the benefits he had assumed were no longer available. Their partnership, once so unified in its certainty, unraveled quietly. I did not ask for details. Some endings do not require witnesses. I felt no satisfaction in watching these outcomes unfold. The idea that justice must feel good is a misunderstanding. What I felt was clarity. The illusion I had protected for years had finally dissolved, and with it, the version of my daughter I had tried to preserve at my own expense. Grief accompanied that realization, but it was clean grief, unburdened by confusion. Neighbors approached me differently now. Some offered apologies, others avoided eye contact altogether. A few admitted they had believed what was convenient. I listened without judgment. People often choose the story that demands the least from them. I had done the same, in my own way, for too long. There was no benefit in revisiting blame. I turned my attention to practical matters. Accounts were secured, documents were reviewed and updated. Every asset was reinforced with clarity and intention. I closed gaps I had once left open out of trust. This was not about control, but about stewardship. I had earned the right to protect what I built, and I intended to do so carefully. The hardest decision was also the simplest. I stopped responding. Messages arrived, then slowed, then ceased altogether. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has a different quality. It is not absence. It is boundary. I did not announce it. I did not explain it. I let it stand as fact. In the evenings, I sat with the reality of what had ended. The relationship I mourned was not the one I had lived with recently, but the one I believed in for decades. Letting go of that belief was painful, but it was also necessary. I could not move forward while holding on to a version of the past that no longer existed. The house did not feel like a trophy. It felt like responsibility returned to its rightful place. I understood then that betrayal carries a cost beyond loss. It demands clarity, forces truth into the open, and leaves behind a reckoning no one can avoid. What I reclaimed was not property or pride, but the right to define my life on my own terms. Time passed in a way it never had before. Not rushed, not suspended, but steady. The house grew quiet again, not with tension, but with intention. I learned how to sit with that quiet without trying to fill it. Mornings became slower. I drank my coffee by the window instead of standing at the counter, always ready to move. I began choosing how my days unfolded rather than reacting to someone else's needs. Living alone did not feel like absence. It felt like clarity. I could hear my own thoughts without interruption, without having to filter them for approval. I noticed how much of my life I had spent adjusting myself to fit into other people's expectations, calling it love, calling it patience. In the silence, I understood that love does not require disappearance. It requires presence, and presence begins with self-respect. I thought often about motherhood, about the stories we tell ourselves to endure what hurts. I had believed that giving everything was proof of devotion, that boundaries were a kind of failure. Letting go of that belief was painful, but it was also freeing. I could love my daughter without surrendering my dignity. I could acknowledge what I felt without denying what happened. Those truths did not cancel each other out. As weeks turned into months, I found a new rhythm. I met with people in my community who had questions, quiet ones, the kind asked by those who were unsure if they were allowed to ask at all. I shared what I knew, not as an expert, but as someone who had lived through confusion and come out the other side. Sometimes it was about paperwork, sometimes about rights, sometimes it was simply about being heard. I did not need a title for it. Purpose does not always announce itself. I did not rebuild my life in dramatic ways. There were no grand gestures or public declarations. The changes were small and deliberate. I reinforced protections around what I owned. I documented what mattered. I learned to say no without explanation. Each of those acts restored something I had misplaced long ago. Confidence does not return all at once. It accumulates. I thought about Rachel often, though not in the way people might expect. There was no anger left, and no longing either. I accepted the distance for what it was, necessary, not punishment, not rejection, but a boundary that allowed me to remain whole. Some relationships cannot survive honesty. That does not make honesty wrong. The garden behind the house became my refuge. It was the same place where I had once stood in the rain, watching my belongings scatter across wet ground. Now it was quiet, tended slowly, intentionally. I planted things that took time to grow. I found comfort in that patience, in the reminder that recovery does not rush itself to be visible. If there is one thing I carry forward, it is this. Dignity is not something you wait for someone else to recognize. It is something you protect, even when doing so feels uncomfortable, even when it costs you the illusion of peace. Silence can be generous, but it can also become permission if held too long. I am not the woman I was before everything fell apart. I am steadier now, clearer. I know what I will no longer accept, and I know what I still have to offer. Age did not diminish me. It sharpened me, and that understanding, earned through loss and reclaimed through choice, is something no one can ever take away again. Every story like this reminds us that time eventually strips away illusions. What remains is not what we owned, not the roles we played, but the choices we made when silence was no longer an option. Respect is not something granted by age, blood, or obligation. It is built through boundaries, truth, and the courage to protect one's own worth. Sometimes loss is not a punishment, but a correction. Sometimes what feels like the end is simply life clearing space for something more honest to begin. Strength does not always arrive loudly. Often it appears quietly, after endurance has run its course and clarity finally takes its place. Dignity survives when everything else is taken, and it grows the moment we decide not to abandon ourselves again. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story. If it resonated with you or reminded you of something personal, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this, and thank you for being here. Encarci.